We unpack this further with Annaline from Debt Rescue. Thank you so much for your time, Annaline. Of course, a drop in inflation, as irrespective of how small it may be, is welcomed, particularly, looking at the precarious situation of the South African consumer. What's to be said about expectations this time around in the CPI figure?
Well, it's difficult to obviously predict, but we are obviously hoping, as your other analysts have also said, that we are going to see it starting to come down. Out of the last 9 months that have been measured, 5 of them have been outside of the range of the 3 to 6% that the Reserve Bank would like. And the 2 months, 2 of the remaining 4 were sitting at 5.9. So the reality is we have been on the outskirts, on the higher end, unfortunately, of what Reserve Bank wants. And we know that today's announcement is most definitely going to affect whatever decision the Monetary Policy Committee is going to make tomorrow when it comes to our interest rates. So hoping to see it come down. I mean, last month it came down by 0.1%, but as you say, every little bit counts. But we have to look at what's happening internationally. We know the international inflation rates are still very, very high. And on the other side, we also know that the impact of interest rate changes do take a couple of months to start filtering through, and the impact or the effect that they are looking for to only come through a couple of months later. So almost guaranteed, definitely a interest rate hike tomorrow.
Having said that, I think we must also discuss that although inflation is dropping slightly, as we've seen in recent months, food inflation as well as fuel inflation is what is hitting consumers the hardest, and that is taking its toll really on the South African economy and weighing on the manner in which we are seeing the decreases in CPI. Let's paint a picture really of the impact those two elements have on the South African consumer, who has long been described as cash-strapped.
Well, indeed. I mean, the reality is for any consumer who has debt specifically, they are sitting with a very difficult predicament right now, because on the one side of their budget, which is the expense side, the living side, they've seen this inflation coming through. And even though we've seen slight decreases recently and in the fuel prices compared to maybe earlier in the year, the reality is it's still sitting at 14% higher than it was in January, for example. But that's only now. There were a couple of months where it was sitting in almost like 40% higher. So that has had such an impact on your living side. And then on the other side, they've had the other impact of the interest rates increases. And that means your debt has just become so much more expensive. So the juggling act has become almost impossible. Consumers have made changes to their budgets as far as they can. They've revised living expenses. And we know one of our major banks released a couple of months ago to say that 5 days after salaries are in the bank, there's no money left after either the debit orders have run. So it's very, very precarious for consumers right now.
A different and interesting take in the economic landscape has been first-time home buyers when we talk about inflation and the increasing repo rate in the country, in that first-time home buyers now find themselves in a hiking cycle, and that's exactly what's expected if we are to go with consensus from analysts from the Reserve Bank tomorrow. How much of a tricky situation has that developed, particularly in the property sector, where a consumer, first-time home buyer, did not anticipate that what they paid for a home last year has exponentially increased to where they find themselves now?
Well, indeed. I mean, because a bond is generally the highest form of debt repayment that you'd most likely have, and the outstanding balance, the impact of an interest rate hike, whether it be 0.25 or 2.5%, you do feel it in your budget. And it's therefore incredibly advisable, especially for first-time homeowners, is to remember when you are working out your budget and you're calculating your repayments, factor in an additional 1 to 2% interest rates on your installment, and make sure that you can still afford that. And of course, all the other things that we have to look at when we purchase property, things like rates, your property taxes, levies, for example, if you're living in a complex, and so forth, maintenance on the property. There's a lot of things to factor in, but definitely interest rate hikes are one of those variables. Make provision for it now and make sure that you can afford it in the event that it might happen.
Annaline, we get the outcomes of the last Monetary Policy Committee meeting for this year tomorrow, but is there at least a near-term outlook for an ease in interest rates as a hiking cycle that we saw, which started in December last year?
Not likely. From everything that the economists are predicting, depending on obviously what kind of hike we're looking at tomorrow, most of them are expecting that we could continue seeing hikes anywhere up until March to June next year still. And hopefully at that point, and then potentially if everything starts turning, it'll come down again. But I think at least for the next 6 months, we are going to continue seeing hikes in the range of between 0.25 and 0.75%.
Thank you so much for your time and insights. Annaline van der Poel from Debt Rescue talking to us about the expected consumer price inflation figures. Those are coming out from Stats SA later today. And of course, it will give a hint to what decision is going to be made by the South African Reserve Bank's Monetary Policy Committee. Those outcomes expected tomorrow, particularly what they say about interest rates. That's where we leave it on the business desk.